The TLDR is that 40k can be a huge and intimidating setting, but it really lends itself to making it your own. And tabletop RPGs are an amazing way to introduce new players to it. Most of this video is about how I approach using the Warhammer 40k setting in my current Wrath and Glory game, but I think that this can be useful regardless of the system you're using. Warhammer 40,000 is massive. It tells stories about a galaxy in flames, empires besieged on all sides, and countless factions of humans, aliens, and everything in between. One of my favorite aspects of 40k, or at least how I interpret the setting, is that it's mostly unreliable storytelling. Everything we know and everything that's canon about 40k may or may not be true. A lot of the things that are delivered as the definitive history of the setting could be myth, could be the truth, could be some story that became exaggerated over centuries. This means that you can take the setting and make it your own, let your group put their own spin on it. I will say that if you're playing with people who are familiar with 40k, it's really important to level set at the beginning of the game. If a player has very specific ideas about what 40k is about and what 40k is, and they care very deeply about getting a piece of the lore right, and it ends up being a different vibe, everybody can end up disappointed. But I'd say that the same thing is true for D&D or any other game. For example, when I play fantasy games like D&D, I don't really enjoy overly silly and whimsical games where everybody flirts with each other, but I do realize that what I just described is the perfect game for many people. 40k specifically is a setting that a lot of people, including myself, get really attached to. So if there's a specific element that's important to you as the game master, or a piece of the lore that is really central to your game, make sure that's very clear at the beginning of your game on session 0 or even before. So when I approach a new game, I treat the setting as a toolbox of stuff and I pick out the things that I want to use. Here's how I'm looking at it for the game I'm currently running. Number 1 is the vibe. The vibe of 40k generally is grimdark. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Try to think about what that means to you. To me, grimdark is not about gratuitous violence, although there's plenty of that too, but it's this overall feeling of hopelessness in the setting despite any fleeting victories we might see. Wrath and Glory specifically is a game of big dramatic action, and your characters can get pretty powerful. For some people that doesn't feel grim enough, but I personally like it because I like the idea that even though you can be a 400 years old bioengineered super soldier who just took down a swarm of Tyranids single-handedly, it doesn't matter. You're raging against the dying of the light. At best, you'll maintain this endless oppressive grind of the Imperium, and at worst, you lose and die and maybe experience a whole different kind of nightmare in the warp. I like grimdark stories when they're done well because they are the crucible that produces amazing characters who, despite everything, find the will to go on and fight on. Getting the vibe of any game is something that takes a while, but here are some things I like to do to kind of set the mood for 40k. First, at the beginning of every session of my 40k games, I always read the passage that begins all 40k novels. Here it is at the beginning of Eisenhorn. I also play some background music. I literally use a playlist on Spotify called Warhammer 40k Music, and every now and then I'll give the players hooks to remind them just how bleak things are in this system. An example of that in my game was an Imperial Guard soldier asking the characters to help him because he's about to be court-martialed and executed just because he was late to a shift. And of course, most importantly, talk to your players during session 0 about the tone and vibe of the game, what's on the table and off the table, lines and veils, all of that extremely important in a game that can get as dark and violent as this. I also use zooming in and out quite a bit, especially in the early sessions. I'll describe a short vignette of something that happens elsewhere in the system that shows the unbearable grind of daily life in the Warhammer 40k universe. Like how after weeks of a seemingly endless fight against demonic abominations that have taken over some city on some remote planet, a squad of Imperial Guard soldiers sit down and share a drink together, the last few drops they have. They've buried their friends, but they have survived somehow, miraculously, maybe by the will of the Emperor. Then they look up and they see this giant walking towards them. At first, just the sheer size of this person looks monstrous, but quickly they realize that this is an Adeptus Astartes, a space marine. The Emperor's angels have come to fight by their side. Tears run down their cheeks when they realize that salvation is here, which is why they are confused and shocked when the giant turns his massive bolter at them. Players new to the setting might think that I'm describing betrayal, and maybe I am, but most likely it's just the cold and calculated protocol of not letting even a hint of corruption survive. And by the way, this doesn't mean that there's no place for comedy in these games. When I say I don't personally enjoy overly whimsical games, it doesn't mean no fun allowed. It's kind of like how the funniest comedies to me are the ones where the actors play it serious, but the situation is funny, and also narratively, if you're telling a story about this grim reality where everything is hopeless, laughter is going to be a coping mechanism that people would go crazy without. So after spending a bit of time thinking about the vibe I'm going for, I move on to the factions of the game. 40K has a million bajillion factions and sub-factions. If you're going to try to include all of them, you and your players are going to be overwhelmed and go crazy, especially if you're just introducing your players to the setting, which is true in my case. I recommend thinking about the factions that you like, thinking about what they want, and how the characters might be involved. This is where the default settings for games like Dark Heresy, Wrath and Glory, and Empyrean Maledictum can really come in handy. All three of these games have really good, fleshed out settings that you can read and draw from. I personally have more experience with Wrath and Glory, so that's what I'm going to use for my examples, and also I'm really working on a game right now. But if you have the time, I would read all three of these because they are really good. In Wrath and Glory, the default setting is the Gilead system, which is a system of planets isolated from the Imperium by warp storms that are caused by the Great Rift. The Great Rift was this massive event in 40K that split the galaxy in half and made travel almost impossible between the two halves. It also, maybe, isolated complete solar systems, with Gilead being one of those. I like the Gilead system because it's big enough that every faction can be reasonably represented if you want them to be, but not overwhelmingly big. And the fact that it's isolated means that you're free to ignore and include any major components of the setting as you want. For example, I just read this Arcs of Omen book, and it has some pretty crazy things in there about space hulks that I'm definitely just gonna steal directly into my game. So for example, here's how I'm thinking about factions in my game. I start with the faction I want my players to work with, but not necessarily belong to. And I'm focusing on the Imperium, and I want to give my players some freedom. So I was thinking I'm gonna start with the Inquisition, or a Rogue Trader dynasty, or both. I like these because they give me a lot of freedom to include other elements, unless I'm going for a game where all the characters are the same archetypes, like they're all Imperial Guard or they're all Space Marines. The idea I had here is that my players will work for an Inquisitor, but will also have some ties to the Rogue Trader that the Wrath and Glory setting offers, Jaquel Varonius. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. I want there to be some interesting faction play here, and the easiest way to do that is to have the Inquisitor and the Rogue Trader both want the same thing and have it be a zero-sum game. The players are going to have to tip the scales on who comes out on top. I also want to designate which factions my players can choose to belong to. Some GMs will just let their players go wild and choose their own from all the factions, which might make sense if your players are very familiar with their setting, but my players are new to 40K, so I think I'll just pick some factions, I'll copy a paragraph of a description about them from the Wrath and Glory book, so the players can sort of get their overall vibe. They don't have to know everything about each faction, and I'm gonna let them pick. For this game, I picked the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, and the Adeptus Ministorum, and the other two factions that we mentioned, Rogue Trader Dynasties and the Inquisition. I'll also pick one or two factions to pull threats from, and this is somewhere where it can really be tempting to just throw a little bit of everything in there because there are a lot of cool threats in these games, but every enemy has a lot of story potential, so just randomly throwing orcs and necrons at the players without a reason feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to me. And generally, personally, I also don't really enjoy random combat encounters. I want that if we're spending time fighting and doing combat, it moves the story somehow. Also, depending on the system and overall power level of your game, different enemies would make more sense. I'm playing a tier 2 Wrath and Glory game, which means that while the characters are formidable, they're not going to be taking on demon princes anytime soon. One of my players wants to be an interrogator for the Ordo Hereticus of the Inquisition, and I'm personally obsessed with chaos, so I want some rogue psyker cults and minor heretical threats in there, and I'm also going to use some gene stealers because I think they're cool. The factions of 40k can really drive your game, so make sure you think about the ones that you want to play with and designate a few NPCs who want things that the players can help with. And both of these books, Imperium Maledictum and Wrath and Glory, and I'm sure Dark Heresy as well, have NPCs that you can use. And of course, you know, there's about 1 million 40k novels. I'm assuming you don't want to do 1 million hours of research before you actually get to play your game. So I'm looking for the easy button here. Next are my starting locations and call to action. 40k is big. Even the limited settings of the Gilead system from Wrath and Glory or the Macarian sector from Imperium Maledictum are big. Unless I know I'm only running a very tight one-shot, I want to start small and see where things go from there and let the story evolve naturally. In my case, I'm introducing the players to both 40k in general and specifically the Wrath and Glory system, so I want to start with a clear call to action in a specific location. Personally, I'm very bad at running adventures out of a book, but Wrath and Glory does have a solid starter set and some fun published adventures. I also made a video about the starter set, and I also made a video which is kind of like a book guide that includes Litanies of the Lost, which compiles a bunch of adventures you can use. My advice is just pick 2 or 3 locations you think are cool, use one of the locations as a way to introduce the game, one location as a transition, and then a third location as the main place we'll be exploring and dealing with threats in. Here's how I'm thinking about this for my game. But first, let's do a little recap. We said that my game is going to be set in the Gilead system from Wrath and Glory, and will feature the Inquisition, a rogue trader dynasty, and the characters are going to be able to belong to these other few factions that I mentioned, Astra Militarum, Adeptus Ministorum, and the 2 other factions. And we said we'll be going up against heretical cults and gene stealers to start with. For my locations, I'm going to go with a hive city on Gilead Prime as my first location, maybe the Rogue Traders flagship as a transition, and then I was thinking to do the bulk of their first adventure on a Space Hulk. Space Hulks are great because they give you a chance to throw a little bit of everything in a very tight, scary, confined environment. And I also have this book, Redacted Records, which is all about Space Hulks, so I'm probably just going to steal a bunch of stuff from there. At this point, I want to work with my players to see what kind of characters they want to play, because I've already put a bunch of limitations here. Like I mentioned in my game, one of my players wants to be an interrogator, which works great with the whole Inquisition theme, and the other player said he wants to be an Imperial Guard soldier who is discovering some latent psychic powers, which I think is so cool because it'll be interesting to see how this interrogator of the Order of the Inquisition that hunts unsanctioned psychers reacts to all of this. So now that I know roughly what my players want to play, I know I need to lean a bit more heavily into the Inquisition. By the way, I think I could have made this work with non-Imperium archetypes as well, like Eldar, but I find that it's much harder if all the players are new to 40k, and it's also much harder for me to reconcile how they might interpret those other species and their role in the galaxy with how I see 40k. So I guess another point here is that as a GM, it's important to know what aspects of the setting are important to you. So I have my vibe, factions, locations, and characters. Now I want to tie it all together with a call to action. What is going to take the characters from the Hive City through the Rogue Trader ship and onto the Space Hulk? So I got some ideas from the books and based on what we already have in the conversation that I had with my players, and here's what I came up with. The Interrogator obviously works for the Inquisition under an Inquisitor. Inquisitors are incredibly powerful, and I like the idea that there aren't many of them around, so having one show up is a big deal. The Imperial Guard soldier is retired from frontline duty for whatever reason the player will come up with, and has been doing jobs for this interrogator for a few years now. This is something we came up together during session 0. I want the different factions to be wary of each other, so I decided that the Inquisitor is suspicious of the Rogue Trader, who, according to the Wrath and Glory book, is the only contact from beyond the Great Rift in years. The Veronius Flotilla emerged from the warp a few years back, and Jaquel Veronius, the rogue trader, very quickly became a very formidable political force in the system, and not everybody's happy with that. We also decided that the interrogator and the soldier have been doing odd jobs here and there for the rogue trader, so they can keep an eye on that organization. So the Inquisitor has the interrogator meet him in the Hive City, and that's where we get to explore the characters a little bit, and we see the Gothic architecture and oppressive day-to-day life in the Warhammer 40k universe. We also decided that that is where the soldier is from, so while the interrogator has his meeting with the Inquisitor, the soldier is at a bar where his old buddy approaches him with the request I mentioned earlier. The Inquisitor knows that a Space Hulk recently emerged from the warp in the system, and he wants the players to drop everything they're doing and go there, and he gives them a lead that some psyker cult leader made this Space Hulk his HQ for him and his cult. He also says that there's something on there, he doesn't know what, but there's something on there that Veronius wants, and whatever it is, the Inquisitor wants to get it first because the Inquisitor wants to have leverage over Veronius. He picks specifically these characters, first because the interrogator has something to prove, and also because he knows that the rogue trader will also ask them to go to the Space Hulk and retrieve whatever this thing is. So after we resolve these conversations and whatever the players decide to do about the about to be executed old army buddy, we fast forward a few weeks to a meeting with Veronius on his flagship. This part I pretty much just lifted from redacted records. The Space Hulk used to be the flagship of another rogue trader, so Veronius wants them to go there and get a relic that belongs to the presumably dead other rogue trader. The relic is a warrant of trade, which is a powerful artifact that gives rogue traders their authority, and he also tells them that a descendant of that rogue trader is also after that warrant of trade, so they better get to it first. At this point, the stage is set and there's a ton going on. Will they side with Veronius or the Inquisitor? You have a ticking clock with this other person also going after the warrant of trade. The Space Hulk itself is full of heretics and aliens, and I would be shocked if this prep alone doesn't give us like 5 or 6 sessions at least. As of making this video, we did our session 0 and 2 more sessions after that. Session 1 was the Hive City and the flagship, and we ended on the characters taking their first steps into the menacing darkness of the Space Hulk, and session 2 was mostly fighting some cultists on the Space Hulk just to learn the ins and outs of combat in Wrath and Glory. The thing I'll leave you with is that with an existing setting like this, especially with players new to the setting, it's incredibly important to be flexible and not cling too tightly to canon and lore. Let the players make it their own within the confines of what makes sense to you and the story that you want to tell, and communicate very, very clearly what those guardrails are. Try to avoid playing the game for them or, telling them that's not what this type of character would or would not say, but also nudge them in the right direction by revealing things about the characters and things that they might know. Like if you meet a Sister of Battle and she says something, that Sister of Battle would typically have blind faith in the Emperor, so what she just said maybe is quite unusual. Drip feed them the lore of the setting. And if you are experienced with 40k, enjoy the fresh new spin that your players are going to give you on this setting. That's it. I hope this has been useful. I'll update you on how the game goes, but in the meantime, go play a game and tell me about it in the comments.